All right, today we are jumping right into the pretty wild story behind aspartame's approval. It's one of the most common artificial sweeteners out there. And based on the material we're looking at, this story, well, it's got everything. Science, politics, big business, so let's get into it.
Like so many big discoveries, this one started completely by accident. We're talking about a chemist who wasn't even trying to find a sweetener in the first place.
But this accidental find, it didn't take long for it to get tangled up in some serious controversy. We're talking about a federal investigation into how the company was even doing its research.
And yet, despite all that drama in its history, you can find it everywhere today. It's in literally thousands of products. Think diet sodas, gum, even stuff like kids' vitamins.
So what is the real story here? How does something go from a lab slip-up to a lightning rod for scientific and legal challenges and then end up in your kitchen cabinet? That's what we're going to unpack.
Okay, so let's set the scene. It's 1965. There's a chemist at a company called GD Searle, a guy named James Schlatter. He's working on a new drug for ulcers, not a sweetener, and he accidentally gets some of the chemical on his hand. A little later, he licks his finger to pick up a piece of paper, and boom, he tastes this incredibly intense sweetness. And just like that, aspartame was discovered.
So what exactly is this stuff? Well, if you break it down, it's basically made of three main parts. You've got two amino acids, phenylalanine and aspartic acid, and then this third piece, methanol. Now let's talk about that first component, methanol. Our source material identifies this as wood alcohol, which is a known poison. It points out that when your body processes methanol, it creates stuff like formaldehyde. Yep, a known carcinogen, and formic acid. And these are described as being both toxic and cumulative, meaning they can build up over time.
Okay, then there's the second piece, aspartic acid. The source calls this an excitotoxin. So what does that mean? Basically, it's a word for a substance that can get your nerve cells so fired up, so overstimulated, that they can actually die off. And this whole idea, it's going to become a really big deal when people start questioning its safety.
And yeah, those safety questions, they started popping up almost immediately. Long before the public had even heard of aspartame, some people in the scientific community were already raising some serious red flags.
Get this, back in 1970, a neuroscientist, Dr. John Olney, tells GD Searle that the aspartic acid in their product is causing holes in the brains of mice. The source says Searle's own researcher confirmed this, but that confirmation never made it to the FDA. Then there was a primate study. They fed aspartame to 7 infant monkeys. The result? 1 died, and 5 of the others had grand mal seizures. And again, our source material states that the real results of that study were also kept from the FDA.
So aspartame actually got a quick initial approval from the FDA in 1974, but Dr. Olney and a consumer attorney, James Turner, raised objections, and that was enough to make the FDA slam on the brakes, freeze the approval, and do something they'd never done before in their entire history, launch a full-blown investigation into the company's research.
And what that investigation found? Wow, it was a bombshell. The FDA's own task force wrapped up their report with this absolutely damning statement. They're basically saying we can no longer trust any of the safety data coming from GD Searle. Think about that. The government's own investigators are saying the research is so bad, the whole approval is now in doubt. The investigators found what Senator Ted Kennedy later described as an unbelievable range of abuses. We're talking about tumors being literally cut out of live animals and just thrown away. They failed to report all the tumors they found. They were logging dead animals as being alive and vice versa. Animal tissues were just left to rot in formaldehyde. They were even writing the rules for the study after it had already started. In just one study, 98 animals died, and they weren't even autopsied for up to a year.
And it gets worse. Dr. Jacqueline Verrett, who is a senior FDA scientist on the review team, claimed that there was an effort inside the agency to sweep these findings under the rug. In her words, this whole experiment was a disaster and should be disregarded. She basically felt the whole thing was a whitewash.
So, with the science now completely tainted by suspicion, the fight over aspartame moves out of the lab and into the corridors of power in Washington, D.C. Okay, this timeline from our source is absolutely crucial, so follow along here. January 1977. The FDA actually recommends a grand jury to investigate Searle for hiding facts and lying. That very same month, who does Searle hire as its new president? A guy with serious political muscle, Donald Rumsfeld. Fast forward 6 months. The U.S. attorney who's supposed to be leading that investigation, Samuel Skinner, quits his job,
to go work for Searle's law firm. And just like that, the grand jury investigation just fizzles out. Then in 1980, a special scientific board for the FDA votes unanimously to reject aspartame. But the day after Ronald Reagan is inaugurated in 1981, Searle reapplies. And a few months after that, Reagan's brand new FDA commissioner, Arthur Hall Hayes Jr., steps in, overrules his own scientific board, and gives aspartame the final stamp of approval.
And this right here is a perfect illustration of what critics call the revolving door between government and industry. The source points out that a bunch of the key officials who were involved in this whole approval saga, including the guy who gave the final green light, Arthur Hayes Jr., they all later went on to take big money jobs with the very industry they were supposed to be regulating.
So with the approval in the bag, the story takes another strange twist. In 1982, Congress passes this amendment to the Orphan Drug Act. It seems kind of random, but it extended a patent for a very, very specific amount of time, 5 years and 10 months.
So who do you think that strange amendment just happened to benefit? You guessed it. It was written so precisely that it only applied to one company and one product, G.D. Searle and its patent on aspartame. And our source notes that the politicians who sponsored this little gift, well, their campaign committees just happened to receive contributions from Searle's top executives.
So this whole twisted road to the marketplace leaves aspartame with a really complicated, really contested legacy. It brings up these nagging questions about where scientific honesty stops and corporate influence takes over. And honestly, people are still debating those questions today.
And a huge part of that legacy, which our source material really zeroes in on, is this massive difference you see in the research results. It's pointed out that when the research is funded by the company itself, it pretty much always finds that the product is safe. But a lot of the independent studies, well, they're the ones that have often raised health concerns. And that gap right there is really at the heart of the whole controversy.
And maybe no one story captures this whole conflict better than Dr. Richard Wortman, a really well-known neuroscientist from MIT. The source material lays out how he started out as a paid consultant for Searle, even defending aspartame's safety. But over time, he became one of its biggest critics, eventually cutting all ties with the company because his concerns just kept growing.
So let's just quickly recap what we've seen here. This story kicks off with a complete accident in a lab, which then spirals into a scandal over scientific fraud and ends with a politically driven approval that flew directly in the face of the FDA's own scientific advice.
And all of that leaves us with this one big fundamental question that the material we've gone through really forces us to ask. In this high-stakes world of regulating our food and drugs, where exactly is the line between a company's interests, the integrity of science, and protecting all of us, the public? It's a question that's just as important today as it was when the very first can of diet soda with aspartame hit the shelves.